students, welcome back to session 3 in Managerial Economics. Here in this session we are going to discuss about a topic from Unit-3 and the name of the chapter is Consumer Behavior Utility Approach. In this particular Unit 3 we are going to focus on the topic so-called a theory called the law of diminishing marginal utility. Much before we get into the theory, actual theory, let us see the introduction lines with regard to the theory. When it comes for introduction part, the law of diminishing marginal utility refers to the common experience of every consumer just like you and me. This law is based on cardinal utility approach. Basically, this law of diminishing marginal utility explains two important things. The very first one is that number of units of a commodity consumed by the consumer, and secondly the marginal utility or the additional satisfaction, sometimes called as, otherwise called as marginal satisfaction derived by the consumer. And this law was first stated by H.H. Gaussen in the year 1854. As this law was stated by Mr. Gaussen, this law was named after his own name as Gaussen's first law of consumption. Hence, this law of diminishing marginal utility, otherwise termed as Gaussen's first law of consumption. But, however, later Alfred Marshall has developed this law in a systematic manner. Now let us see the definition of law of diminishing marginal utility. The very first definition was given by Mr. Alfred Marshall. According to Marshall, the additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase of his stock of a thing diminishes with every increase in the stock that he already has. And definition 2. As the consumer increases the consumption of any one commodity, keeping constant the consumption of all the commodities, the marginal utility of the variable commodity must eventually decline. And this definition was given by K.B.N. Let us see what actually the theory of law of diminishing marginal utility actually mean. When it comes for the explanation or the exact meaning of the law of diminishing marginal utility, it basically explains the functional relationship between the stock of goods and its marginal utility derived. In simple words to understand, being a consumer, as we go on consuming additional units of the same commodity continuously without having any intervals, without having any break, the additional utility called the marginal utility out of each additional unit decreases. Here in this theory, we just take a small illustration. With the help of illustration, let us see how the law of diminishing marginal utility actually work out practically. So for the illustration purpose, here we took 3 important columns, and the first column comprises of units of a commodity offered to the consumer, that is apples we have taken here, and the second column represents total utility which is indicated by TU, and the third column represents marginal utility which is denoted by MU. If we notice the table, let us see the explanation part of the table. If we notice this illustration or the schedule of the table, from the above table, as the consumer consumes the apple units one after the other, from first to fourth apples, if we notice the total utility increases from 40 utils to 100 utils, but here we notice the TU increases though, but at a diminishing rate. Likewise, from the table we also notice that marginal utility decreases from 40 utils to 10 utils. The same table, if we notice again, At the consumption of fifth unit of apple, the total utility reaches maximum. But on the other hand, the marginal utility becomes 0. After this particular point, when the consumer consumes one more unit of apple, that is, if we again offer the same consumer without any break, sixth unit of apple, after the consumption of sixth unit of apple, when we notice that the total utility decreases, but the marginal utility, so called indicated by MU, becomes negative. If the same piece of information which is illustrated in the above example, if we plot on a piece of graph, and we can notice the graph as above mentioned. Let us see the graphical representation of law of diminishing marginal utility. Let us go for the explanation part of the graph. Dear students, we can notice from the above diagram or graph that we took on OX axis apples, that is the units of commodity offered to the consumer, and on OY axis we measured total utility indicated by TU, and marginal utilities MU are denoted on OY axis. TUC stands for total utility curve, MUC stands for the marginal utility curve. Still, when we further notice from the graph that as the total utility curve is sloping upwards, initially reaches maximum at a point so called H, and at this particular stage the MUC becomes 0 at a point called M. As the TUC is decreasing at a point H, MUC becomes negative. Fine. Now let us see the law of diminishing marginal utility, the relationship that exists between total utility and marginal utility. See, in case of law of diminishing marginal utility, the relationship between total utility and marginal utility, we can bring in three important gunshot points. Let us see the first point of relationship between TU and MU. When the marginal utility falls but MU is positive, we can notice that total utility, that is TU, increases at diminishing rate. Secondly, we notice that when the marginal utility is 0, total utility TU reaches maximum. And at last point, when the marginal utility MU is negative, total utility decreases. However, the law of diminishing marginal utility is based on certain assumptions. Now let us see the assumptions of law of diminishing marginal utility. Point number 1. The law of diminishing marginal utility is based on cardinal utility approach. Cardinal utility approach means where utility can be measured numerically. The second assumption is that the tastes and preferences of the consumer should remain constant. The law of diminishing marginal utility is also based on the assumption that the units of the commodity should be identical, which means must be of reasonable size, neither too small nor too big. There should not be any time gap between the consumption of one commodity and the other. Also, the other assumption is that all the units of commodity should be of divisible in nature. When we notice the other assumption, the law of diminishing marginal utility is based on the assumption that the consumer should behave in a very rational way, which means that the consumer should always try to maximize utility out of consumption of number of units offered for the consumer. Also, the law of diminishing marginal utility is based on the assumption that the income of the consumer should remain constant during the consumption process. And next assumption is that marginal utility of money should always remain constant. Now let us see the exceptions of law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility is based on certain limitations or exceptions, which mean that this law does not hold good, or this law does not hold fit for certain cases. So let us see the exceptional cases of law of diminishing marginal utility. Point number 1. This law is not applicable for hobbies like stamp collection, old coin collection, etc. because as we keep on collecting, the additional satisfaction or the additional utility or the marginal utility keeps on increasing, which is against the law. Hence, this law is not applicable for hobbies, stamp collection, coin collection, etc. This law is not applicable for drunkards because as a drunkard gets more additional utility or more marginal utility out of having additional pegs of liquor. The third exceptional case is that the law of diminishing marginal utility is not applicable for miser. Next exception. This law does not hold good if the taste and preferences of the consumer changes during the consumption process. This law is not applicable for indivisible goods. Also, there is another exceptional point that this law does not hold good if the income of the consumer changes. And next point is that this law is not even applicable for money. Hence, money is also an exceptional case for law of diminishing marginal utility.